for us, and they've all been absolutely wonderful. Since he retired, he's a molecular geneticist, but since he retired, he and his wife, Noreen Rudd, have done lots of traveling, and everywhere they go, they look at everything. They're keen birders, but they're also interested in every other part of the natural world. And David has a particular interest in trees and plants, and he was the lead on two of our wonderful brochures, the woodland plants in Delta and flowering plants in Delta. And I know for a fact that he either knows or can find out about other trees from different parts of the world because I've asked him about things on a few occasions. He's also director at large on our executive committee, and we've been so pleased to have him on the committee because he has a very wonderful presence. He helps us with so many things in so many different ways. Tonight, he's going to be talking about sailing in the West Papuan Islands and crossing the Lydekker line. Now, if you don't know what that means, you won't be alone, because I think most of us either didn't know or probably still don't know what the Lydekker line is. I gather Lydekker is actually someone's name, and it's a boundary, a geographic boundary of sorts, a zoological one. But David will explain that to us, I'm sure. And I'm ready to turn it over to David for what I know is going to be another fascinating presentation. Thank you, David, for being with us again.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll get this started, and I'll try and explain what Lydekker's line is so that you understand it as I understand it. When I was looking for a title, I didn't know quite what to do, and I thought, well, what was the trip? Well, the trip was a trip that went through the eastern part of Indonesia. What was there? Well, some very important biological research was done there back in the late 1800s and 1900s. And part of it led to these lines on the map. So let me get this started. Okay, what I'm going to try and do is, there are three things that I should remember: is not to stand in front of the people on my left, not too much in front of the people on my right. My tremor is not great today. I mean, take medication to control it, but it's one of those things that when you get put under stress, it increases. So that's something I have to deal with. Don't worry about it. It's not addictive.
We'll tell a joke.
Okay, Indonesia, crossing the Lydekker line. Well, before we get going too far, I want to show you a little bit of, there's a question that people have asked me, and that is, why did you go to Indonesia? And I'm going to see if I can get rid of these extra little things on the screen and explain it. Back in 1988, this fellow, Russell Mittelmeier, who was a biologist, looked at the world and tried to decide what countries were different from other countries. And he defined the term megadiverse countries. And this map of the world shows in green those countries that are considered to be megadiverse, according to his definition. And it says at least 5,000 plant endemics, and other plant species that are unique to that particular country, and a marine ecosystem, and that sort of eliminates certain countries. But if you look at Africa, there are a lot of countries that are not green because they lack certain aspects of the marine and biological diversity. So if you look at this map, and if Noreen and I looked at this map, we'd ask the question, okay, where have we been and where haven't we been? So that's sort of where we start on this. And This map has birds where we birded around the world in various places, and fish where we've scuba dived or snorkeled in various oceans of the world. And there was an area that we were interested in that is bright green, and I'll just go back a second. And it's down in the area of Australia and Southeast Asia. And that's an area that is important biologically, and for two reasons. One of them was a fellow by the name of Wallace, a biologist, British biogeographer, I guess, had studied this area extensively and made the comment that at one part of that region between Southeast Asia and Australia, the Malay Peninsula and that, there's a transition between the species that have Oriental influences or had originated in Oriental areas, meaning China and up that way, and the species that originated in Australia. So the marsupials and the mammals, the marsupials in Australia, and the mammals on the other side, but also there are plants that are on both sides. And at some point, there's a transition between these. And that's where we come to the individual by the name of Lydekker, who is another Brit studying the same area. And he drew one of the lines and Wallace drew another line. So I could have said traveling in Wallachia, which is another thing, and I'll show you a little bit of that. So in deciding where to go, you look at the diversity of the world and you ask the question, where are we going to see some more different birds and different types of animals? And you can see in this particular list, and I'm not going to use a mouse, and I'll try and explain things because I realize if I use the mouse, my trimmer is bad and it goes all over the place. And it's down on the table down there. And if I use a laser pointer, which I could use in the room, the people at home will have no idea what I'm pointing at because that doesn't go through on Zoom. So on the third line down is Indonesia, very biodiverse area. The second line down, Colombia in South America, is another biodiverse area that we haven't been to, and it's on our list, but this particular trip came up as an opportunity because we'd originally planned on going to Papua New Guinea, which was number 16 on the list down at the bottom, and that trip got canceled due to COVID. So we had a deposit on a trip to go to Papua New Guinea. And when that didn't work out because of COVID, we moved that forward, and it turned out to be essentially 3 years forward, and did a trip that was part on the island of Papua New Guinea, the West Papua part of it, and a part on the islands in the eastern part of Indonesia. So let's look at Indonesia. And Indonesia is a fascinating country. It's huge in terms of spatial. I think 1/8 of the world's circumference. If you measure from the far east to the far west of Indonesia, it's equivalent to 1/8 of the circumference of the world. Remarkable. 17,000 islands. That's 1,000, not 1,700. It's number 4 in world population. Everybody knows that 1 and 2 are China and India. 3 is the US, 4 is Indonesia. But what's fascinating when you fly over the islands of Indonesia is in many of these islands, there are people on the coast, but there's nothing on the internal parts of the islands. There's very little activity in the internal part, except in areas like Jakarta and the larger cities. But on the bulk of the islands, the population lives on the periphery. Of particular interest, I guess, is that 400 active volcanoes. It's on the Ring of Fire, and average 3 quakes per day. I found that rather remarkable. But when we were flying to Indonesia, and this is the route we took, was coming down from the top from Taipei. We flew Vancouver, Taipei, and then Taipei to Jakarta. And when we landed in Taipei in the morning, having a coffee at a Starbucks, ping email came in, and it was, I think, Marion asking, "Are you guys okay?" Well, we hadn't even heard about the earthquake in Indonesia, which had just happened. But she was concerned about it. It turned out it was about 160 miles from Jakarta where we were going to land, but it was a very surface quake and very destructive, but just on the surface and didn't affect much beyond the particular village and area where it actually centered. So we flew on to Jakarta, stayed overnight, which really wasn't overnight because it was late, and got in late and left at 2 a.m. and flew to Ambon for, I think I said 3 hours and 40 minutes. That gives you an idea. That's like about from here to Winnipeg or a little farther. So further east, roundabout way to get there, but that's about the only way you're going to get there these days, and particularly with a lot of the flights canceled into the various destinations around the world. Travel is getting more difficult, and it's also pricier. So on this particular slide, I've also put a few other areas that we've birded. In Australia, we've done several trips and explored on the east side, and I'm going to use the mouse here, to the tip of Cape York. Whether you can see it on the lower right-hand side of the screen. And that is very close to New Guinea, and in fact shares some of the birds with New Guinea because of their proximity. And we've also been in the Darwin area and through to Kakadu and Broome on the far coast. Also on the upper left side of the map is Thailand, where we spent about 2 months in 2002. And one of the places that we stayed was on the beach in southern Thailand, and it was absolutely beautiful, very pristine beaches. But if you remember, it was late 2002. I think it was Boxing Day, in fact, that the huge tsunami happened, and that area was totally destroyed. All the places that we stayed, nothing was left of that whole area. It's just the luck and timing. If you travel, there are risks. And some of the risks when you go to an area that's volcanically active can be volcanoes or tsunamis. So we had birded in Thailand, and in 2015, we sailed from Singapore to Phuket in Thailand with some friends on a boat delivery on a catamaran. And every night we'd go into the coast and stay in an estuary somewhere. So we saw a lot of water birds and a lot of the coastal birds through that area. We did a few trips into the interior as well. So we've seen birds in this area, and what we were doing in this trip is entering an area which included Lydekker's line, and hence the type. Now, this particular slide shows Wallace's line and Lydekker's line, and I'll explain the difference between the two of them. Wallace's line is really the extent of the flora and fauna of Australia or the Papua New Guinea side going towards the west. In other words, the Australian fauna influence and species essentially die out at Wallace's line, and you get into the Oriental flora and fauna. Lydekker's line is the opposite. It's the Oriental influence coming down from Southeast Asia, and it's drawn in this particular S shape. And a few years after this particular line was developed, Thomas Huxley modified the line because he did some further exploration of species in the area and actually changed the direction. He has a modification to Lydekker's line, but I'm just going to talk about Lydekker's line. So this area between the two lines is referred to as Wallachia. And you'll actually see bird books that refer to the birds of Wallachia because it's a slightly different mix of birds than you see elsewhere. And in this area is where we traveled. And I've got, and this red stars are the areas that we birded extensively. So I'll show you in more detail as we go on, but you can see that there are probably 5 or 6 stars on the left side or the western side of Lydekker's line, and 5 or 6, one may be right on the line, on the eastern side. So that's why I call it crossing Lydekker's line. Now you all know as much as I do about it.
When was that line established? Like 1900?
1895. So it's been around a while. Wallace's line was 1859. Lydekker's line was 1895. Okay, and another reason that we wanted to go to Southeast Asia was Noreen had this desire to see birds of paradise.
Before she died.
Before she died, yeah. So that was an important part of this trip, and that was why the trip had originally been planned for her 80th birthday. We were going to go to Papua New Guinea. After talking to one of the guides who had done the trip in Papua New Guinea, we traveled with him in Namibia. He said, "You're going to fall. It's going to be muddy. It's it can be pretty miserable." Anne knows what it can be like in that area of Papua New Guinea. So when it got canceled and we moved the trip to this mobile hotel approach, which is a boat. Now, before I go on, I wanted to give you a sort of general look at this, to put it in perspective. Indonesia has almost 1,700 species of birds. 26% are endemic, in other words, found only in Indonesia. Australia has just under 900 species of birds. 46% are endemic, in other words, only found in Australia, not found elsewhere. Obviously, migratory birds come through both those areas. If we go to Papua New Guinea, 765, 11% endemic. Not very many endemics in Papua New Guinea, but West Papua, which is the western extent of Papua New Guinea, and the part that belongs to Indonesia, has 40% endemics. So you have to ask yourself, what is it about this area that allows that sort of difference in the number of endemics versus non-endemic species? In other words, migratory species are going to make up the rest. On the lower left, I said North American, about 1,000 species, only 10% endemics. And we all know that most of our birds are migratory birds. They go to South America. They overwinter in nicer climates than we particularly have. But in this particular area, there are a lot of birds that spend year-round, and that is the endemics. I think Papua New Guinea's number of endemics or percent at 11% is perhaps low because many of those species move into Indonesia or across that barrier, and also down into Australia. So many of the birds that you see in the York Peninsula in Australia, you will also find in Papua New Guinea. The difference between those two in terms of miles is 60 miles. I think there are probably little islands in between, so the distance is probably less than 40 miles, which is the distance between the mainland and Haida Gwaii, for instance. That's the sort of distance you're talking between islands. So I guess if you fly high enough up, you can see the other island and you'd have a place to go to. Well, interesting, I found this fact. Papua New Guinea has more languages than bird species, more different languages. And these are all the tribes. And what you have to know about Papua New Guinea is it's a very hilly country. And so there are all these hills and valleys, and they isolated the people as well as isolating the birds. And so people developed their own languages. And I was staggered by that number, more languages than bird species. Okay. I'll start the trip. We arrived in Ambon from Jakarta, and the next morning early caught a flight to the island of Buru. Now, Buru is just a little bit to the west of Seram, which is another big island, and I'll show you more general maps as we go along. It's about a 40-minute flight, and we stayed at WW1, and I thought World War I resort. Well, it wasn't that, but the reason we went there was to do some birding, and it's actually this wood industries resort. And it was a resort built for the executives of this wood industry, and been built, I guess, in 1945. And this company has been logging the island since that time. And it's rather comfortable. They fed us well, they looked after us, but we were the only guests. And our purpose of going to Buru is because it has two different habitats. It has coastal, low coastal land, very high humidity, interesting, hot, your equatorial countries. And it has highlands, and the highlands have different bird species. There are 32 range restricted species, as they call them, and 19 endemics. And we were able to see or hear 17 of the 19 endemics, a good number of the range restricted species as well. And that was by doing, let me see, lowland forests. We did 3 excursions into the lowland forests. That would be like all morning or all afternoon. And in the highlands, we spent 5 trips up into the highlands. And some of those were early morning to try and find owls. So some of these range restricted species actually exist on Buru and Seram, which is the island just to the east of it and right next to Ambon. And that's why they're not considered endemic to Buru. The upper part of this photo was taken early morning, looking at from the highlands, looking out into the valleys, and these valleys are full of fog. And you're at about 4,000 feet or just below 4,000 feet in these highlands. So it's cool. It's damp because they have the usual rainfalls, which come unexpected, massive thunderstorms, and then they're gone. And getting up to the logging track was not a simple business. There was rivers to ford. Some of them were straightforward, you just drove through them. Others had bridges, and in this lower left corner, you can see what I say is risky business. These boards collapsed as the wheel of the vehicle went over it. And I actually had video of going through this, but I'm not going to show you that. On the right is a vehicle that we ran into, a 4-wheel drive pickup truck with boards across the back, and it's a bus for the local natives, the indigenous people, and they had 20+ kilometers to go sitting in the back of this thing, and just a crowd of them all enjoying themselves and looking at these crazy people looking at birds along the roadside. These are a few of the birds. I mentioned the Madanga trail, upper trail, which was a pretty messy piece of climbing up a slippery slope. Noreen and I decided not to do it. Talked to the guide, and David said, well, it's not likely we'll see it. It hasn't been seen since 2016. But I think it was 2016. But anyway, it's not seen every year, and it's looked for a lot. It's a very rare bird and believed to be related to a pitta, but there's some questions about that. These are some of the other birds that we saw, the ones that are endemic to the island, and I believe it's the Moluccan Scops owl that we saw was a lifer for both of our guides. They'd never seen it before. When we did these trips to the highlands, they would bring with them hot lunch, and they'd set it up on the roadside with tables and plastic boxes for us to sit on and serve it up. Occasionally it would rain when this happened, so we just sat under umbrellas or they'd pull out a tarp. And then after the 4 or 5 days in Buru, we flew back to Ambon. And I'm just going to give you an idea of Ambon because it's an interesting city. Its name's changed. Can't remember what it was before, but it used to be the Dutch East Indies headquarters before it was moved to the Jakarta area. And it was the heart of the spice trade. And I think Ambon Island was one of the 2 islands where nutmeg and mace were grown. I believe that's correct. So this is a view from our hotel looking down at the busy streets. And you'll see the barricade running down the middle of the street. I think they must put a barricade there to keep people on the right side of the road because people paid very little attention to lines on the road. They meant nothing. And there was always a flurry of motorcycles. And motorcycles would have 1 person, 2 person, 3 person, 4 person, or 5 person. I don't think we saw 6, but 5 was quite common. And they'd be piled on. They'd be mom and dad and a string of kids stuck between them or hanging on the back. And we always said, where are the hospitals? You know, but we never saw an accident, even though they zipped in and out of traffic at quite an incredible rate. So when we went back to Ambon, the idea was we wanted to go and see a megapode that had a nesting site on this little island just across from Ambon. It's called Haruku. And what I've done in this picture is done a Google Earth image. And the left shows an overview, and the upper right corner is, and I think I've got Elizabeth sitting right on top of what I wanted to show. But anyway, what's under Elizabeth in this particular thing is what's shown in the green figure in the lower center right. And that's from the aerial view. If you zoom up enough, you can actually see the spot that we went to. And it's a sandy spot, not on the beach, but back in the woods.
I can't fix it. Maybe we'll fix it. Okay.
Well, I'll take whatever you can give me.
Are you on speaker view by chance?
Let me just see. I think I am. Yep. Yep. I don't.
Oh, well.
Sorry, I should be in that corner from Elizabeth. So anyway, is it the computer or not? We headed from our hotel to the shore and went out this rickety wharf, and you had to watch it because sometimes there were boards missing on the wharf, and climb into these 2 boats. And both boats had 3 40-horse outboards on the back of them, but they just had essentially a bucket of gasoline with hoses going into it and ran them. No life jackets. And it's getting towards dusk because we were going to be there. These birds don't arrive until it gets dark. Anyway, just to give you some idea. The bird in the center is a Moluccan scrub fowl. This bird is fascinating because it does not incubate its eggs. And then on the right, lower right corner, a fellow is holding 2 eggs that they dug up because the locals actually harvest the eggs from these birds on a regular basis and been doing it for over 100 years, or hundreds of years, I guess. And they harvest a few and they allow a few to incubate and the young to hatch. And in the center bottom, you can see a hatchling. Now this bird probably hatched the night before, came out of the sand, and it takes them about 3 months, I believe it is, to hatch. And when they come out of the sand, they fly off immediately. And this fellow just released it on the far right. You can see the bird in the air. It just flew off as soon as he let go of it. And this is a bird that's just come out of the egg the night before. So these birds are what are called super precocial, completely ready to go the moment they get up. But the real question is, where are their parents? Where are their friends and neighbors or whatever birds have? Well, they somehow know how to find them. And some time later, will come back to that same sand patch and lay their eggs. And the sand patch is the incubator because the sun warms the sand. And that's part of the reason that these are called incubator birds. And there are certain species of these scrub fowl that use volcanic sand in where there are hot springs and things like that to actually incubate their eggs. Quite a few different species. There's also the bush turkey in Australia, which is also another one of these incubator birds. They build big mounds of vegetation, essentially a compost heap, and they put their eggs in there. And the heat of the compost is what does the incubation for them. So they don't worry about it. They just lay their eggs and let the fermentation keep them warm and hatch and eventually join the adults. Fascinating business. Okay, so after that excursion, we all survived. Interesting. All the life jackets were in a plastic bag under the very front of the boat. None were distributed to anybody. And we were traveling in the dark with a flashlight. And these boats at full speed. Well, crazy, but it's third world country, and that's the way things are done. So the next morning at Papuan, we did some birding at two different sites. One was upland and one was wetland, and picked up a few of the endemics in that particular area. Not the waterbirds. Waterbirds weren't endemics. We've seen the wood sandpiper in Africa and various other places. But the Amboan white-eye and the superb fruit dove were endemic. And on the far right is the boat that would become our hotel for the next 12 days. So the boat is called the Indonesia, and it was launched, I believe, in the spring of last year. So it was less than 8 months old when we got aboard it. So it looks like an old boat, but it was, the owner was on board with us. She was a marine architect, and she'd had this boat built because she had been working in Jakarta area, and she got tired of being on land, and she said, I built a boat. And she started just before COVID, and it was built during COVID, and at some point they didn't know whether they were going to survive, but they were able to come out the other end. It's all rigged for diving and for touring, but probably their biggest business is diving in the Raja Ampat area. So we left Amboan, got on the boat, left Amboan, and went up to the island of Buano on the upper left corner of your screen. And that's where we woke up the next morning. I believe we got in about 3 a.m. I'm guessing because the engine noise died down and we got quiet. And we headed in just after dawn, had a quick bite to eat, and probably 5 a.m. we were on the beach. And it had rained heavily overnight, thunderstorms. And these pictures I took with my cell phone, and I was really fascinated by the look of them. If you look, they're almost like watercolors, this particular one. And I think you get the idea. This is a really interesting place. And this is looking into the village. We landed on the wharf and went into the village. People were just getting their day started, and we were headed up into the hills. And this is a very wet hen, and she has, I'm trying to figure it out, probably 5, 6, 7 chicks, 3 on her back, a couple under her tail, and there's more feet down underneath than she has. So I think there's some more there. Anyway, it's just interesting. The chicks were trying to keep out of the wet because it was muddy and wet everywhere. And we headed up into the jungle. There was a trail, but it had become overnight a little bit of a creek bed. And so we were wading up the greasy, what was it, sort of reddish mud into the creek bed. And we saw a few birds, not a lot, a claret-breasted fruit dove on the right there. And then one of the birds we were looking for, we did not find, but we found one that is considered a supertramp species, the island monarch. And the one we were looking for was the black chin monarch. And I got this picture off the internet because it did not put in an appearance, even though on the previous 2 trips, I believe they had actually seen it or heard it. Not so lucky. When we came back, we were treated by the villagers to a demonstration by the children of dancing. And if I have a minute afterwards, I have a little short video. It's about 7 minutes where I've taken some of these clips that I have video on and strung them together in a quick snapshot view of the area. And it includes some of these kids dancing. We were anchored off Bueno, and from the boat went snorkeling on this little island, one of the 17,000 islands in Indonesia, and absolutely fascinating to snorkel there. Pristine water, clear, lots of different marine life. And as you proceeded deeper, you would see larger fishes. So early afternoon, we headed for the middle of Seram, where we were going to spend 3 days and do some birding. And then the 3 dots indicate 3 days of birding in the different areas around central Seram. And what we were doing was birding the highlands again, because the birds in the highlands are different from the lowlands. So highlands and lowlands. And we went up the Trans-Seram Highway, and these are a few of the species we see, some of which are endemic and seen only on the island of Seram. Some a little further afield, but considered essentially endemic to the island of Seram. The pale-vented bush hen, which is upper central right, you can see, is an interesting story with that. We'd been hiding out from the rain under a little shelter on the roadside, and the guide, whose name was David as well, heard this bush hen, and he said, "You know, I've seen that. I've heard that bird so many times." He said, "I've never seen it." And the other guide said, "Yeah, you never see that one. It just doesn't appear." And so he decided he was going to try and call it out. And he took his Bluetooth speaker and he put it on the other side of the road. And so it's a big strip of blacktop, and we all stood there and waited and played the call of the pale-vented bush hen, and one appeared. And I got this picture before it headed out across the road. And when it hit the road, it was going so fast that most people got pictures of a streak. I happened to catch it. And then later, a second one, because the one that went across the highway started calling, and the second one came out and did the same thing. And I caught it also, and before it actually left the roadside. And both guides said, "Never seen one of those before." Anyway, interesting story. You hear them all the time, and we heard them many times after that, and we had heard them before that, but didn't know what you were looking for. Now I know what you're looking for, but probably never see another. Okay, this is looking at the crest of the Trans-Seram Highway. It goes across the island and in the highlands. And this is just a look at the group of us strung out, looking at various things. One of the guides on the far right, and the other guide is down at the farther down the road with another spotting scope. These butterflies actually were roadkill from vehicles that had gone by, but they didn't move, so they were easy to photograph. The one on the right, the green one, is a moth. The other 3 are butterflies, or one looks like a skipper to me. I'll give you something about the Indonesia vessel. This is loading aboard one day in Seram. We headed back for lunch. We're going to do another excursion in the afternoon, late afternoon, because you usually went back for a siesta in the heat of the day. And as we were headed out, the guide, David, said, let's see if we can find the Chinese crested tern. Now, the Chinese crested tern was considered extinct up to about year 2000. And after that was found a few breeding pairs in an island off Korea. And somebody more recently has found them, I guess, in the Philippines. And one had been seen in this area previously, and they wanted to look for it. So we went searching for the Chinese crested tern. Now, one thing in this part of the world is there are a lot of these floating fishing platforms. And we went and looked at about 3 or 4 of these floating fishing platforms, and there wasn't a bird on them. They were just bare platforms. But off in the distance, I think it was Lev said, there are some birds on that one over there. So we went to the more distant one. A few of us got wet, and it was covered with great crested terns. Now, it turns out the Chinese crested tern often associates with the great crested tern. And this picture actually shows the Chinese crested tern, but I don't expect you to pick it out. There are also some other terns. In fact, there were 6 different tern species, I believe, on that structure. The Chinese crested tern is in the upper right corner now, and you can see it has an orange, bright orange bill with a black tip. Otherwise, it looks very similar to the great crested tern, but a very rare bird for that area, and actually very rare worldwide. Just very few pairs. So this is the boat. It's called a Phoenici rigged sailboat. That's the old classic style sailing vessel, and some of them were sailing. Ours had never sailed. I talked to the owner, and she said, "No, we've never sailed it. We just haven't had the situation." It's a power boat and works very well for a base for both diving and for touring these islands. Lots of very pretty sunsets in this area. When you came back to the boat after a morning's excursion or an afternoon's excursion, didn't matter. Anytime you came back, you were always greeted with a cold face cloth, white, damp, in a roll, and it'd come out of the fridge. And boy, did that feel good in that temperature. So you could swab yourself down and feel a little more human, and then a cold drink. And in this particular case, it was fresh coconut. They were all cold. They'd been in the cold somewhere, stored, and then tops dropped off and straws added. And so we were all always treated with that, or fresh squeezed juice of some type. And if we were out snorkeling or diving in the water and you'd lost some body temperature, you came back to hot ginger tea. And that was fabulous. Sweet hot ginger tea.
Paper straw or plastic straw?
Sorry?
Paper straw or plastic straw?
Unfortunately, plastic. You have to remember that this is third world country. They don't have paper straws. They get their plastic straws from first world countries. Okay, from Suram, we headed to Obi. I'm just gonna have a sip of water here. So total distance about 135 miles. And I'm gonna go back here. And this is a fishing platform. And friends of ours the people that we sailed from Singapore to Phuket with said they'd crossed the Suram Sea, and they said, you gotta watch it at night because you run into all these fishing platforms and there's no lights on them and they're in the middle of anywhere. And the water is 1,000 feet deep. Well, that's exactly what they are. They're fishing platforms. They probably have a tether or an anchor of some sort going down to the bottom. And I expect some escape from the individuals in stormy weather. But what they do is they're an item in the water. And I don't know whether you know this, that fish congregate around such structures. Doesn't matter whether it's sargassum in the Sargasso Sea or whatever, seaweed. That's where the fish go and the organisms and the feed. And so individuals own these platforms that are sitting in the middle of nowhere. Well, we did circle around one, and if you look at the birds in the area, this is a circle around one of these in the middle of that transit, and a list of some of the birds that, well, I think this is all of the birds we're seeing in this particular one. So interesting. And if I go back here, you'll see redneck phalarope. People here have seen the redneck phalarope.
In red.
The Jaeger, parasitic Jaeger, another bird that comes through this area, but down in that area. Okay, the island of Obi again has a bunch of endemic. It has a small number of endemic species, but it's interesting because it's actually how do I put it? It's to the west of Lydekker's line and to the east, but it's where Huxley drew a kink in the line when he went and looked at this area, because it has a slightly different flora and fauna. Anyway, lot of nutmeg trees on this island, and it's interesting. I didn't really know the anatomy of the nutmeg. I know the little nutmeg that you buy and you grate and whatever, but the cover of that is what mace comes from, and then there's a fleshy outer part, and the fruit looks like a peach. So that if you split a peach open, you'd see the pit in the middle. Well, the pit in the case of the nutmeg has a wrapping on it. They call it the aril, and that's when you dry it, turned into mace. Anyway, these are a few of the birds and some dragonflies, pygmy eagle in the upper left corner. And there were other variety of birds on Obi, and these are a series of them. And we went looking for the Obi barking owl. And I don't know if Anne will know about barking owls from Australia. First time we heard a barking owl, we thought it was a dog, and we were in our campsite in Queensland somewhere. Anyway, they do sound an awful lot like a dog, and we were able to find one. And these pictures are taken at night when it's dark with a flashlight, and somebody puts a flashlight in the bird and you snap a picture if you're lucky. Metallic starling, bright red eye, they're a very interesting bird. They do a lot in northern Australia and Cape York area, the Iron Range. Huge numbers of them there, and you see murmurations of them at dusk because they're large numbers of them moving, and then all of a sudden they disappear into the vegetation on the islands that they're doing these murmurations over. Really rather fascinating. The carnunculated fruit dove is only found on Obi. It has this lump on its nose. Why? Who knows? Chattering lory is only found, I believe, on Obi and Halmahera, which is just to the north. So if you look at this picture in the upper left side, there's a piece of land coming down. That's Halmahera. So there are 55, and we saw 55 of 222 species, and one endemic woodcock that we didn't see. We went looking for it, waited for it at dusk, but it didn't put in an appearance. We left there after 2 days of birding and headed out late afternoon, I believe it was, to headed for Kofiau. And when we woke up early morning, we were at this island called Pasang, and it's really just a small island. And we did a circumnavigation of the island in small boats and then snorkeled around it. Fabulous place to go diving. This is a picture of a beach kingfisher just lifting off. There were quite a few birds, and we saw some megapodes there. You could see them from out in the water, but everything was small and the boats are going up and down, and so you don't get very many pictures under those circumstances. And the diving, as I said, was really interesting. Lots of wildlife, lots of corals. And one bird that was evident on the island was the dollar bird. And Noreen and I know the dollar bird from Australia and also from Southeast Asia. It's a migratory bird, and one was sitting on this island in the middle of nowhere, you know, not 80 or 90 miles from anywhere. It's just sitting on the island and very recognizable. Dollar birds, when they fly, they have white circles on their wings, so they're very characteristic. But they also, when they're sitting there, even at a long distance, are quite characteristic. So after doing some snorkeling there, we headed for Koh Phi, trying to make it in the same day. It was a long transit, and late in the day, we actually arrived at Koh Phi. We would pass these long boats, people fishing out from villages and heading home. They obviously knew where they were going, but they were really in the middle of nowhere as far as we could tell. This is a front deck, and I put this in for two reasons. I was sitting by myself looking for whales, and I wasn't the only one looking for whales. There were lots of people, but I think Noreen took this picture and captured just me. But on the lower right side, there's a ladder that comes down, and at the base of the ladder, you see a pair of thongs. Why are they there? Well, I learned the hard way. I went up to the top deck one afternoon, I think, to hang up a bathing suit to dry, just about burned the soles of my feet. So the deck that we're on is covered with an awning, but the top deck was just like fire under your feet. And that's why the thongs were there. Anybody could just slip on a pair of thongs if they had to go up to the top deck. So at Koh Phi, they had a wharf, lots of kids around. And this picture there's two aspects of this picture. The main thing is you see the kids are all barefoot and running around and that thing. These are coral islands. And you know what coral is like underfoot? Tough. Well, you see the piles on the right-hand side of these kids. What this village has done is picked up all the coral or lumps of coral and piled them. And there are all these piles of coral in different places and sand in between. And so the kids are running around in the sand, and the adults as well. So that's one way to deal with not having shoes. And this was as we were about to depart the island, they all came down to the wharf to see us off. And it was late in the day by the time, getting towards sunset, by the time we were leaving. But we did manage to see the Koh Phi paradise kingfisher, which is a racket tail bird. So it actually has, the tail is longer than this, but you can't see it in this particular picture. And the Koh Phi monarch, which is, again, one of these species that evolved on that particular island, is only ever found on that particular island. Now, Koh Phi is in the part of Indonesia known as the Raja Ampat archipelago. And this is a fabulous diving destination for people who are scuba divers or snorkelers or who want to see some really pristine coral and whatnot. It was made in a marine park in 2009 and has pretty strict regulations to prevent further contamination after there was a spill from a vessel there at one point. So 75% of the world's corals are found there. Now, what you have to think about it, where is Raja Ampat? Well, it's in Indonesia, very near Papua New Guinea, but it's actually on the boundary between the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. So the waters that are moving through there really are transiting those two large bodies of water. I put 699 mollusk species. I thought somebody must have looked for the number 700, but didn't find it. It was 699 was the quoted number, and lots of different fish. So this is in the Raja Ampat area. We're coming up in the lower part, coming up from Koh Phi. We stopped at Merpati and birded the island. It's very interesting. And that's where we ran into what they call supertramp species. These are species of birds that often enter new vegetation areas earliest. They're the first colonizers of new areas, new volcanic islands. They're not specialists, they're generalists as a rule. And when birds evolve, they tend to evolve with the vegetation and develop a specific association with the food source. The generalists, the supertramps, don't. They just go everywhere and eat everything. They can usually fly. But a lot of these species that have become endemic in these islands started out as a supertramp species and evolved from those into a very specific species with an association. So from Merpati, we followed a sort of circuitous route. Let's see if I can get this to work. No. Merpati, and then we went up snorkeling, stopped overnight, evening at Mayas Khan, and I'll show you something of that. Went to Wagio, and birded looking for birds of paradise. And the next day we went looking for another bird of paradise, then to Cree, and finally to Sarong on the island, on Papua New Guinea island. So I'm just going to briefly, because we're running out of time here, folks. This is scuba diving, or we weren't scuba diving, sorry, just snorkeling in the area. And there are lots of interesting fish, and we saw several turtles, and farther out there were sharks. You could see great distances. But on the beach, or close to the beach, where there was a bit of a surge, the sediment would be stirred up and would be hard to see. So the farther out you went, the better. So scuba divers would have a better time in that particular environment where we were. This is talking about the supertramp species, and as an example, an Erifer and fantail, and the island monarch is also another one of those supertramp species. Now, I mentioned Mayas Khan, the island that we anchored off in the evening. And this is a picture taken, and I have a video, which is much more interesting. But I'm not sure that you can see that on this particular slide. It's like somebody taking a pepper shaker and shaking a pepper shaker on your slide. Because what's in the air here are thousands and thousands of fruit bats. They roost on the island, and at dusk, they lift off the island and head to the mainland being Papua New Guinea, to feed on fruit overnight, and then they return and roost the night or the daytime. A raucous noise.
What was the name?
They're fruit bats. And the picture in the upper right, just under Elizabeth, is a fruit bat. And how big is a fruit bat? Well, I got a 2-foot wingspan, or web span, whatever you want to call it with bats. They're a very big bird. And when you see hundreds of thousands of these things just lifting off the island and flying off into the sunset, it's really quite amazing. Sorry. Of course, I mentioned the birds of paradise because that's what we went to see. The picture on the left is a red bird of paradise, and I did not take that picture. The one on the right is a Wilson's, and I think Noreen took that picture. So I'll just finish off with a little bit about the birds of paradise here. We landed on the island Wagio, and in the past, the only way you got to see the Wilson's bird of paradise, which is the very colorful one on the lower right, was on the island of Batata, I believe it is. And it was about a 5-hour hike. And you want to be there at dawn because that's when they start calling and the leks. So it was about a 5-hour hike up. So, you know, you leave at 2 or 3 in the morning and hike up the hill, or you rent a helicopter, take you up there, and you wait overnight. And there can be bugs. I mean, this is tropical jungle area. Somebody associated with Rock Jumper had found 2 leks of Wilson's bird of paradise on the island of Wagio and had built blinds at these 2 sites. and they were within about 10 or 12 minutes walk of each other. So that what they did is they took us by four-wheel drive vehicle. I got 6 four-wheel drive pickup trucks and piled a couple or 3 of us in each of them, and took us up to close, and we had about a 15 or 20-minute walk into the where the blinds were. And the idea was the group split into half. Half went to one blind, half went to the other blind, because you never know what's going to happen. Are the birds going to appear or aren't they going to appear? Well, I went one way and Noreen went the other. That was the smart way, because then we got to see both of them. As it turned out, the birds of paradise almost all turned up at the blind Noreen went to. The blind I went to, one turned up. Now, I did get some video of it, but after about an hour, I guess, one of the guides came down and they took us to the other site so that we got to see the birds of paradise, because they were still there, because there's some females and males as well. So these are the sort of blinds that were built. They're just old green grubby tarps, and if the guide didn't think you could see through the hole, he'd just take his machete and poke another hole and cut another trapdoor so you could get the right height for your camera. It was they really looked after us in that sense. And in this particular picture in the upper right, my camera's on a tripod because I packed a tripod with me for this so I could try and shoot some video. And I took this picture with my phone. The next day we went looking for the red bird of paradise, and that was about a 40-minute walk uphill. Fairly steep, I guess. It was a good hard slug at the early morning dawn, using headlamps. This is actually coming down afterwards. And we went past one site where the red bird of paradise had been seen previously. And one of the people was too tired, and they said they weren't going to go any further. They were just going to stay there. A red bird of paradise did turn up at that site, and we could have all waited there. But we went on to the further site, and sure, they're there way above you in the trees doing their demonstrations. You really can appreciate the effort that the National Geographic photographers went to get the behavior on video of these birds. Really rather remarkable. So in the process of going to these birding sites, of course, we did other birding after looking at the birds of paradise. In the morning, going in the dark, called out a Papuan bubuk owl and a marbled frogmouth, and then the Wilson's male and a female just under Elizabeth there. And Papuan frogmouth we saw coming down from the red bird of paradise. There were 3 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them in the dive resort that we walked through to head up to the red bird of paradise. The crowned pigeon that's in the center bottom is a much rarer bird than the birds of paradise. It landed in a tree above us and then flew to a better perch where everybody could get a picture of it, and stayed there for about 20 or 30 minutes. It's really quite a remarkable bird, almost 2 feet high. I mean, it's a really big, remarkable. And the brown-headed crow is a COVID, but it's very secretive one and only found in thick bush and small numbers. So it's uncommon sighting. And then back down at the water, I'll show you here. This is palm cockatoo. Now, we saw those in the northern tip of Australia as well. The red bird of paradise that you see here was, and the top picture was snipped from a video I took. The bottom picture, you can see the head, which is a green chin and black on it, and some yellow on one side of that branch, and on the other side is the tail, and some of the tail wires are these tail structures that they have. The glossy mantled manicode on the right is one of the members of the bird of paradise family, but is not as exotic as the ones that we think of as birds of paradise with all the appendages. So lots of sunsets, lots of interesting time. This is some of the people. Not everybody was on the top deck drinking and enjoying the sunset the night that this was our last night aboard, but some of them were. And from there, we headed to the island of Papua, West Papua, and the island of New Guinea. And we were able to actually spend 4 days, I guess, birding on New Guinea before continuing, but I'm going to stop there. And I'll take any questions if you want. And before I stop, I do have a 7-minute video, and I apologize. It's running long, but I can show you a 7-minute video, which is little clips and snippets of what we saw in the area. If you're interested in that, I'll run it after this. So, thank you very much.
That was pretty wonderful, David.
This is just an overview of the whole area covering our route.
David, other than owls, were there any other night birds? Like you have the common nighthawk there.
We didn't see it, but yes, there are. And several frog frogmouths. So, yes. It's the list of birds is much more diverse than our pictures would let you see, because it's an area where birds are high in the tree, high in the canopy, thick foliage, hard on your neck, but fascinating. Anybody interested in just a quick?
Yes.
I'll see if. Let's see. I'll figure out how to do this. Yeah. I think that's about as big as I can make it because of the number of DPI that it takes. It's a big file. So this is just shooting through Ambuan, looking at the road. That's our hotel appearing there. Interesting thing is, it used to take about an hour and a half to get to the hotel, and they put it in a bridge, which was what we would cross. It was just before Christmas, the end of November, beginning of December. The streets were decorated for Christmas.
Move up to the mic.
Sorry. I didn't want to stand in front of everybody. This is Christmas decorations in Ambon, and just gives you some idea of the city. It was all brightly lit. And this was headed for the megapode. This is the group of people, and there's a little orange thing right in the middle of all those people, and that's all the life jackets for all of us. And of course, the two boats have to race, and so they're going flat out across this. And we returned the same way, high speed in the dark. This is a megapode picture that was taken with a flashlight at night. We didn't do that when we were there because it disturbed some. This is some of the villagers dancing, some of the kids, and there were different groups of them, different age groups doing the dance to music. And Somehow I don't have the audio working on this, but anyway, at one point, one of the parents, I believe, came out and threw some money on the ground. Well, obviously the idea was to collect donations. Yeah, there's some money being thrown and they collected it. And speaking of money, I think I had 500,000 rupee with me. Sounds like a lot. 500,000 rupees, about $45. I mean, to them it was a lot of money. To us, it would be next to nothing. These are the youngest in the group. This is birding on Obi. It's just the two vehicles, just standard like Toyota pickup trucks with planks of wood across that you were sitting on, and you jounce down the road, no seat belts, nothing. Anyway, this is the way that you got to these areas. There was no other way to do it. And you'll get some idea. We're just sitting stacked in on these vessels, and a few people got to sit in, sometimes if they had a seat beside the driver and the other cab. This is the island of Sang, the one in the middle of the crossing from Obi to Papuan, and middle of nowhere, but the waters were pristine and clear and just beautiful. This is looking at Mayos Khan, where the bats are leaving at dusk, and as it gets darker, you begin to see them. And this will pan a little bit to the right, where there's more light in the sky, and you begin to see then the numbers that are actually there. Really rather remarkable. Come on, panel. I don't know whether the focus is good enough to pick it up. No, it's pretty hard to see in the.
You can see them.
No,
No, you can't see.
no, you can't see it. My apologies. I thought you would be able to. This is the Wilson's Bird of Paradise, the single male that turned up at the site that I was at. And at one point, he turns around and does a display. And just very briefly, these are only, but I was able to collect the calls and post the callings on eBird as well. So this is where he's just going to display. And you watch as he puffs up and spreads out his hood, so to speak. Come on. No, he did it. There, you can see this. And it just lasts for a second, but I'm not a female, so he's not interested. And this is the red bird of paradise. And here he goes across way up in the canopy, but you know, that's what you see of them. Unless you're in the canopy yourself. And they flew into the area, and I was able to capture this a bit. And I think maybe another he's on the branch there on the far side. You can see a bit of the tail and a bit of the head. But you can see getting a decent picture of these birds is a tricky business. And you can understand why National Geographic people put blinds up in the trees and spent sometimes days. So that's it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, David. That was wonderful. And I inadvertently just.
They said you can turn the light on.
Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me, David?
Any questions or comments for David before we let him go?
I did want to say that I managed to lose a couple of chat comments here, but both Annie Caps and Marion said how wonderful presentation was and how wonderful it was for David to share those things with us. And Audrey commented the same thing, that was wonderful to be able to see this fantastic trip without actually going on it.
Jim has his hand up.
Yes, Jim?
How many days did you spend on the entire trip?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
How many
How
days?
many days did you spend on your trip?
About 3 weeks.
3 weeks all told,
Yeah.
I think.
Yes. And